Hi everyone, this is Mrs. Baker, and today we're going to be writing our notes on energy flow in ecosystems. Our starting question is, why are food chains generally limited to 3 or 4 levels? So first let's talk about energy. Energy flows through an ecosystem in one direction. Which is from the sun or chemical compounds to autotrophs another word for the autotrophs is the producers, and then to various heterotrophs or consumers. Now, all of you should be a little bit familiar with food chains. I know that you've seen these before in other classes, maybe even in middle school or maybe even elementary school. Food chains show how matter and energy move through ecosystems in a series of steps showing which organisms transfer energy by eating and being eaten. So we're going to draw an example of a marine food chain. It's pretty important that you are familiar a little bit with marine food chains, because since we don't live by the coast, we don't usually see these encounter these in our daily lives, but they might ask you about these on a test. So it's nice to be familiar with other ecosystems besides the ones that we have around here. So in this example, we're going to have these little critters called phytoplankton. And phytoplankton tend to be autotrophs. Well, actually they are autotrophs. They make their food just like plants do, usually using photosynthesis. Some of them also can use chemosynthesis. The phytoplankton are then eaten by some other organisms called zooplankton. And the term, or the prefix zoo, like the zoo, means animals. These are not animals, but they are sort of like animals because they eat other little critters in the water. The zooplankton are eaten by fish. And then the fish might be eaten by a squid. And the squid is eaten by a shark. There's another fin over here. Okay, so hopefully you can draw prettier pictures than me, but kind of get the idea there. Each organism in a food chain represents represents a feeding step or trophic level. That's what they're called, trophic levels. In the transfer of matter and energy. Food webs are different than food chains because these are models that show all possible feeding relationships at each trophic level in a community. And it links all food chains in an ecosystem together. And on the other side of your notebook over here, you're going to actually draw, do an example of a food web. So I won't draw a picture for you right here. But basically the big thing here is that there's lots of connections, whereas in our food chain, we only had one level of connections. It was more linear. You also need to be familiar with ecological pyramids. And this is a diagram that shows amounts of energy or matter at each trophic level. And there are 3 types. Okay, let's draw each one. In an energy pyramid, we see our producers are at the bottom, and they get energy from the sun, and of that energy, 90% of it is actually turned into heat or waste, which means as they're growing, they are releasing heat. As our cells go through cellular processes, they release heat. So what about the other 10% that stays in their bodies? Well, when the producers are eaten by a primary consumer, 10% gets passed on to, for example, insects. Let's say that these producers originally had 10,000 kilocalories. If only 10% goes up, you're basically going to move your decimal over one place to the left, and that means that the insects now have 1,000 kilocalories available to them. Well, and then the mice that eat the insects are only going to get another 10%. Because you guessed it, the insects are wasting 90% of that energy as heat. So, how much is left for the mice? Well, if we move the 10,000 kilocalories, if we move the decimal once over to the left, that means the mice have 100 kilocalories. And then the snake will only have 10 kilocalories available. Because, again, the mice transfers 10% up, but 90% of it was actually lost to heat. So that's one thing you need to remember about the energy pyramids. As you go up, you always lose you lose 90% of your energy to heat and waste, but 10% is available to the level above you. And you always have producers at the bottom. So you can see you need a lot of producers in order to sustain an entire ecosystem. In a biomass pyramid, we actually see how much mass there is of each organism. So for example, you can have 8,000 grams of grain, and these are your producers, they come from plants. And then the chicken that eats the grain is only going to have roughly 800 grams. Again, about 10%, if you move the decimal over once to the left, about 10% is actually transferred over to the chickens. And then a human only maintains 80 grams of the 8,000 grams of grain that we started with, because 10% got moved over. 10%, 10%. Again, just move the decimal over once to the left. That's the trick there. And then we can also have, finally, a pyramid of numbers. For example, if we have grasses in an ecosystem, there might be 3,000 individuals there. And grasshoppers will be less, maybe about 250. And birds that eat the grasshoppers maybe will only be 25. And then the fox, maybe there's just one of them. So because there's, certain amounts of energy get transferred up and only a small amount of that mass gets transferred up, we actually end up having many consumers, and as we move up the trophic levels, the number of individuals become less and less. You couldn't have an ecosystem where you had so many foxes that they were out hunting all of these animals, because that would actually destroy the entire ecosystem. So that's how we end up with smaller amounts of the actual consumers than we do of the producers. So these are your notes on energy flow in an ecosystem, and like I said, you're going to also do a food web and some calculations and some more examples on the left-hand side. Thank you.